We are attempting all the time to create a logical, rational path through the day. To the left and right, there are an amazing set of distractions that we can't afford to follow, but the poet is willing to stop anywhere. This is a pretty amazing quote from Billy Collins, and I definitely feel what he's saying as we were reading some of his poems. It feels like you're kind of going through a mundane day, but then you kind of get these glimmers of this pleasure and surprise that comes with all of his poems. So we're going to be presenting to you about Billy Collins. I'm going to share a little bit about his backstory and his life and move into a couple interesting facts. Hayden's going to share a couple more interesting facts, and we're going to talk about which poems we think you should first read. Starting with Billy Collins. So he was born in New York City. Kind of moving into his education, he got a bachelor's at the College of the Holy Cross and a master's at UC Riverside. His bachelor's was in English and his master's was in romantic poetry. After that, he kind of adventured into a lifelong pursuit in academia. He was a professor at Lehman College, and he was a professor there from 1968 to 2016. Now, according to our book here, there are a couple poems that they thought were notable. The first is Questions About Angels, The Art of Drowning, Picnic, Lightning, Sailing Alone Around the World, Ballistics, Horoscopes for the Dead, and Aimless Love. So some pretty interesting titles here. And I'm going to kind of talk about the feel of his poems now. And it's best understood in terms of music. So Collins' work often plays with the melody of a song. So to kind of describe this, the pentameter is an undertone from which an idiosyncratic rhythm moves around and away. Rhythm of Collins' poetry enforces slowing down, a tender lingering over everyday life. So it's not always very serious stuff. It's not kind of this overly dramatized picture of love and war and all these things. It's kind of a sweetness of every day and just kind of thinking about everyday type things. Our textbook said that he has quick humor and a breezy tone, so it kind of makes it seem as though nothing too important is going on within his poems, and that kind of then hits you with a couple surprises that we'll share in a little bit, because you read this as being kind of a lighthearted poem, but then there's a couple kind of really deep moments that he actually has, along with a lot of really good humor. Hayden and I were just listening to reading a couple of his poems, and we're kind of cracking up that, and we'll share a couple of those. Kind of a way to read his poems, another kind of good fact, is you want to read it slowly. Kind of like if you imagine you're going through the day. When you go through the day kind of too quickly, you're not really going to remember anything about the day, but when you kind of take things in, you're going to appreciate that day even more. So in the same sense, you want to read these poems very slowly so that you don't miss out on the pleasure and the surprise. When you look closely, you're going to be able to see the art of his poems. At first glance, they seem kind of simplistic about everyday life, but as you kind of look into them further, there's an art there that is really beautiful. So all throughout, you can kind of see like an analogy between his poems and everyday life. When you're kind of going through everyday life quickly, you're going to miss out on the arts and the beauty, but when you're contemplating every little thing throughout the day, the moon, the stars, the clouds, little things like that, or interactions with people, you're going to come out of it with much more depth, and you're going to see every day like a work of art. So that's the best way that I can describe his poems. Hayden's going to talk now about his humor and some of the distractions, and we'll explain what that means.
Yeah, so to begin with, a huge component of Billy Collins in his poetry is humor and distraction. And so with those two, he really bases all of his poetry on those two fundamental ideas, and really has a sort of convincing and just super simple yet effective method of conveying these to the reader. One example of humor is in his poem Forgetfulness. I definitely recommend a starting poem if you want to get into Billy Collins. And a few lines to begin this poem say, the name of the author is the first to go, followed obediently by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one you have never read, never even heard of. As if one by one, the memories you used to harbor decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain, to a little fishing village where there are no phones. So beginning with that, you can just see how he starts off maybe sounding a little bit seriously about, forgetting something you've read before, and then he just goes straight into the sort of humor of it, of like, your brain retiring to the southern hemisphere, you ending up in a little fishing village where there's no phones, and it's just totally disconnected from the other parts of your brain. Another aspect which I covered was his distractedness. And one of his poems called I Chopped Some Parsley while listening to Art Blakey's version of Three Blind Mice. So to begin with, Art Blakey, he was a jazz drummer back in the day. He had his own band with a lot of famous people, such as Freddie Howard, who was a really famous trumpet player. But anyways, in this poem, Collins starts off by writing probably 20 so lines about the three blind mice, and near the end of him talking about that, he just gets totally distracted and just says, by now I am on to dicing an onion, which might account for the wet steam in my own eyes. So Freddie Hubbard's wonderful trumpet on Bleeding Green, which happens to be the next cut, cannot be said to be making matters any better. So you can just see how he goes from something he's writing about the poem into just some totally different reality of just normal day-to-day life that to many people would be totally normal and sort of common occurrence. He finds humor in it and distraction as well. And then lastly, another poem that really expresses humor is called Tuesday, June 4th, 1991. Some of the beginning lines of this poem says, by the time I get myself out of bed, my wife has left the house to get her botany final, and the painter has arrived in his van and is already painting the columns of the front porch white and the deck in gray. It is early June and breezy Sunriddle Tuesday that would quickly be forgotten if it were not for my writing these few things down as I sit here empty-headed at the typewriter with a cup of coffee, right and sweet. So here we can totally see that this poem is just where he takes a meaningless life experience and just throws it onto lines of the poem, and it becomes poetry that you can find just pretty good humor on it. And lastly, while most of his poems are in sort of free form and don't follow a specific historical poetry pattern, at times he does use things such as sonnets to express his poetry. In one such poem called Sonnet Itself, he humorously sort of ridicules a sonnet by writing a sonnet of just absolutely meaninglessness. A few lines from this one says, all we need is 14 lines, well 13 now, and after this one, just a dozen. So here he's just counting down the lines of a sonnet while he's reading it, or writing it in the moment. But yeah, overall, Billy Collins is a great poet, very funny and humorous if you're looking for some light-humored stuff, and greatly recommend it.
Absolutely, and like you get kind of the humor, and you also get a lot of depth. Going back to forgetfulness, it starts with this very humorous, relatable kind of line that when you're reading a book, you're going to just eventually forget the author, the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, and then you're going to forget the entire novel. That's super relatable, I'm sure, for a lot of us. But then at the very end, it says, no wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem that you used to know by heart. It kind of ends with this really, really deep tone, which I thought was pretty interesting. Same with Tuesday as well. It's like a really mundane day, but he chooses to write about it, and for some reason he does that, and he adds depth to it. So it's kind of like a really cool, he reflects life and looks at it in a way that we wouldn't really think about it. He's thinking about it with depth and humor, and it kind of makes you want to go and enjoy the day after reading it. So again, we highly recommend that you read and listen to Billy Collins. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation.